Consciousness returned in fragments, like light filtering through thick ice. First came sensation, cold stone beneath his back, a sharp ache in his ribs, the faint burn of air entering lungs that had forgotten how to work properly. Then sound. Wind, distant and hollow, moving through something vast and open. Not the sealed hum of a station, not the artificial quiet of a medical bay. Real wind. Ethan Cole realized he was alive before he understood where he was. That realization brought no comfort. He tried to move. His body refused. Pain flared in immediate protest, radiating outward from his chest and shoulder in clear, unapologetic warnings. He stopped trying. Survival training took over. Inventory first, panic later, breathing painful but steady, limbs present, responsive enough. Memory fragmented, the evacuation, the collapse, the screaming, and the child. Ethan forced his eyes open. The ceiling above him was not metal. It was stone, ancient, pale, carved with lines that caught the light in subtle ways, as if the architecture itself had been designed to guide the eye gently rather than dominate it. Tall arches rose overhead, framing windows that revealed something impossible. Mountains. Snow-covered peaks stretched into the distance beneath a pale sky, sharp and clean and undeniably real. No domes, no shielding, just open air and cold sunlight. He was not on a ship, he was not on any station he recognized. Then he felt it, presence, not movement, not sound, just the unmistakable awareness of being observed. Ethan turned his head slightly. She sat beside him, tall, still, wrapped in dark armor that seemed grown rather than forged, etched with intricate patterns that flowed across her form like frozen shadows. Her hair fell straight and pale over her shoulders, silver-white against black metal, and resting upon her head was a crown delicate, sharp, unmistakably royal. Her eyes were blue, not soft blue, not welcoming, the kind of blue found in deep ice and distant stars. An alien queen. Ethan's heart rate spiked hard enough that he felt it in his throat, and then he noticed the second figure. A girl sat close to the queen's side, her posture careful, composed in the way only children forced into discipline too early could manage. She was young, perhaps 10 or 11 by human standards, with the same pale hair and blue eyes, though hers were wider, filled with something unguarded. Concerned, they were not speaking, they were waiting. For several long seconds, none of them moved. Ethan swallowed, his throat raw. "Okay," he rasped. "Either I'm dead or I've made a very serious mistake." The queen inclined her head, the motion precise, controlled. "You are alive," she said. Her voice was calm, resonant, carrying an authority that required no volume. "And you are awake. This is acceptable." The girl exhaled quietly, tension easing from her shoulders in a way no training could fully suppress. Ethan's gaze flicked between them. "Where am I?" "The citadel of Vera," the queen replied. "On our home world." That landed slowly. "Alien royalty, home world citadel." "Oh," Ethan murmured weakly. "That's not great." The girl frowned at him. "Mother," she said softly in accented standard, "he looks afraid." "I'm afraid," Ethan agreed immediately. "That seems reasonable." The queen's lips curved, not quite a smile. "You may rest. No harm will come to you here." "That's usually what people say right before harm comes," Ethan muttered. The queen studied him for a long moment, her gaze sharp, searching, as if weighing something unseen. "You do not remember," she said finally. "Bits and pieces," Ethan admitted. "Things falling, running, carrying someone." The girl's eyes widened. "You carried me," she said. The memory surged back in a painful rush. A shattered transit hall, structural alarms screaming. A small figure crouched behind debris, frozen in terror. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath. "You were alone." The queen's expression tightened just slightly. "Yes," she said, "she was." Silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. "I'm sorry," Ethan said quietly. "I didn't know who she was, she was a kid. There wasn't time to think." "That," the queen replied, "is precisely why we remained." Ethan frowned. "Remained." The queen gestured subtly to the chairs beside his bed. We have been here since you were brought to us, until you woke. His breath caught. You've been sitting here. For 2 cycles, she said. It is our way. The girl reached out hesitantly and touched Ethan's hand. Her fingers were warm. You were warm too, she said softly, when everything was breaking. Something in Ethan's chest tightened painfully, and this time it had nothing to do with his injuries. The Queen rose, her presence filling the space without effort. My name is Sagalith, she said, and this is my daughter, Lyria. You saved her life. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. Then, he said quietly, I'd do it again. Sagalith watched him, her gaze unreadable. That choice, she said, has consequences you do not yet understand. And for the first time since waking, Ethan felt it. Not fear, not pain, but the unmistakable sense that his life had already shifted onto a path he could no longer step away from. The pain receded first, not vanished, never that kind, but dulled into a distant, manageable presence, like a warning light rather than an alarm. Ethan lay still, staring at the carved stone ceiling while his breathing slowly found a rhythm that didn't feel like it might betray him at any moment. He became aware of small things. The faint scent of snow carried in through unseen openings. The soft rustle of fabric when someone shifted position. The subtle hum beneath the silence, not machinery, but something deeper, like the citadel itself, was alive and breathing around him. He turned his head slightly. Queen Sagalith had resumed her seat beside the bed, posture perfectly aligned, hands resting calmly on her knees. Lyria sat closer now, her small form angled toward him, blue eyes never leaving his face. You are no longer in danger, Sagalith said. The physicians assure me your injuries will heal fully. That's good, Ethan replied. His voice still sounded rough to his own ears. Because I'm fairly sure something large tried to turn me into paste. A structural beam, Sagalith said. 2, in fact. One struck your shoulder, another your ribs. Ethan winced. I always knew my luck would run out eventually. Lyria tilted her head. What is luck? That, Ethan said carefully, is when something bad happens, but not as bad as it could have. Sagalith's gaze flicked to her daughter. A human definition. Ethan managed a faint smile. We have a lot of those. Silence followed, but it was no longer tense. It felt deliberate, as if this moment mattered. You were not supposed to be there, Sagalith said at last. Ethan frowned. The station. No, with her. She nodded subtly toward Lyria. Your evacuation orders placed you at a coordination node 3 kilometers from the transit hall. Ethan closed his eyes, memory sharpening now that his mind was clearer. Timeline collapsed. Shuttles were loading too fast. People were getting lost. I went back to sweep. You disobeyed protocol. Yes, you endangered yourself. Yes, you had no obligation to her. Ethan opened his eyes and met her gaze. She was scared. Lyria's fingers tightened around the edge of the bed. That, Sagalith said quietly, is not an argument our commanders would have accepted. Ethan shrugged as much as his injuries allowed. Then I guess I'm not a good commander. Sagalith studied him, long and intently. Ethan felt the weight of that attention, not hostile but penetrating, as if she were peeling away layers of justification and finding nothing hidden beneath them. You did not know who she was, Sagalith said. No. You did not know what saving her might cost you. No, and yet you chose her. Yes. The Queen rose again, pacing slowly to the window. Sunlight caught the edge of her armor, tracing its patterns in pale silver. In our culture, she said, intent matters more than outcome. You did not act for reward, recognition, or allegiance. You acted because your instincts told you a child should not die alone. Ethan stared at the ceiling again. Is that unusual? Sagalith turned. Among my people, yes. That answer unsettled him more than he expected. Lyria slid from her chair and stood beside the bed. She hesitated, then climbed carefully onto the edge as if afraid of causing pain. You talked to me, she said softly. I did. You did not stop talking, she clarified. Even when you were running, even when the walls were breaking. Ethan let out a weak breath that might have been a laugh. Sorry about that. I tend to ramble when I'm terrified. I liked it, Lyria said. You told me about water that falls from the sky and turns solid. Snow. Yes, you said it was cold but beautiful. It is. She looked thoughtful. You said people still go outside when it happens, even though it hurts their skin. Sometimes especially because of that. Lyria nodded solemnly, as if filing this away for later consideration. You kept your voice steady. It made the noise less loud. Something twisted in Ethan's chest. Sarilith watched the exchange in silence, her expression unreadable. When the ceiling collapsed, Lyria continued, quieter now, you turned. Ethan swallowed. Instinct. You put yourself between me and the falling stone, she said. Mother says you did not survive because you were strong. You survived because you chose correctly where to stand. Ethan closed his eyes. Sarilith approached again, stopping close enough that he could feel the faint chill radiating from her armor. The vigil is now complete, she said, but what it signifies remains. He looked up at her. You said that before, that it was binding. Yes. What does that mean for me? He asked carefully, because I didn't ask for anything. I still don't. Sarilith inclined her head, nor did we expect you to. She extended one gloved hand, not in command, not in threat, but in formal offering. You are now under the protection of my house, she said. You may walk our halls. You may speak our name, and if ever you call for aid, we will answer. Ethan stared at her hand, then at Lyria, who watched him with hopeful intensity. And in return, he asked. Sarilith's eyes softened just slightly. In return, she said, you will live as you already have, with the same integrity, the same instinct. That's it. That is everything. Ethan exhaled slowly. Well, he said, that's a lot. Lyria smiled. For the first time since the collapse, Ethan realized something fundamental had shifted. He had not simply survived. He had been claimed. Ethan slept. Not the shallow, half-alert rest of emergency rotations or transport jumps, but real sleep. Heavy, dreamless, the kind his body seemed to demand with quiet insistence. When he woke again, it was to warmth instead of pain, sunlight instead of alarms. He lay still for a long moment, recalibrating. The room had not changed. Stone walls, high arches, windows framing distant snowfields and jagged peaks, but something else was different. He was alone. No queen, no princess, no silent vigil. For a brief, irrational moment, a hollow unease settled in his chest, as if the presence he had woken to before had anchored him in ways he hadn't yet understood. He pushed the feeling aside, scolding himself. They had stayed long enough, more than long enough. A soft chime sounded. Before he could respond, the door opened soundlessly and a figure entered, tall, slender, with elongated ears and calm, observant eyes. The alien wore robes rather than armor, pale blue fabric embroidered with sigils Ethan didn't recognize. Lieutenant Ethan Cole, the figure said in precise standard. I am Saren, physician and appointed liaison. Appointed by? Ethan asked. Her Majesty, Saren replied smoothly. Please remain still. I am here to assess your condition. Ethan resisted the urge to sigh. Of course you are. The examination was efficient and oddly gentle. Saren's hands never lingered, never treated Ethan as fragile or inferior, only injured. He appreciated that more than he expected. You were fortunate, Saren said as he finished. Another few seconds beneath that structure, and your survival would have been statistically improbable. People keep saying that, Ethan muttered. I'm starting to think it was personal. Saren's lips twitched in what might have been amusement. You are healing well. Her Majesty's concern ensured the best care available. That sounds expensive. It was, Saren agreed without hesitation. You should understand, this level of attention is not extended lightly. Ethan shifted carefully, sitting up against the pillows. About that, this bond, family adjacent, is that as serious as it sounded? Saren's expression grew solemn. In Varen society, he said, there are only 3 ways to be bound to the crown: birth, marriage, or protection freely given and freely accepted. Ethan blinked. Marriage. Saren inclined his head. Not your circumstance. Good, Ethan said quickly. Let's keep it that way. Saren studied him with open curiosity. You are uncomfortable with proximity to power. I work in disaster zones, Ethan replied. Power usually means someone else made a mistake. That earned him a quiet, genuine smile. The bond, Saren continued, grants you rights and obligations. You are protected under Varen law. Any harm done to you is considered harm done to the Crown's own. That's intimidating. Yes, and the obligations. Rare personal. When invoked, refusal is dishonorable, but invocation is exceptional. Ethan frowned. Why tell me this now? Saren stepped back, gesturing toward the window. Because today you will walk. Ethan followed his gaze. Below, beyond terraces and stone paths, he could see the Citadel gardens. Vast, terraced expanses of frost-touched greenery, winding water channels that shimmered with faint light, and pathways carved directly into the mountain itself. And Saren added, because Her Majesty has requested your presence. That hollow unease returned, sharper this time. Queen Sarilith waited in the gardens. She stood near a low stone wall overlooking the valley, armor replaced by dark ceremonial robes that flowed rather than imposed. Without the crown, she seemed different, still powerful, unmistakably so, but less distant, more present. Lyria sat nearby, kneeling beside a shallow pool where water flowed upward before cascading back down in impossible loops. She looked up when Ethan approached, her face lighting with immediate recognition. You're walking, she announced. Barely, Ethan said, but yes. She smiled as if this were a personal victory. Sarilith turned to face him. You are healing faster than expected. I've been told I'm stubborn. That too is evident. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind carrying faint crystalline sounds from the water. Ethan became acutely aware of the space between them, not physical distance but something else. Awareness, consideration. You are uneasy, Sarilith said. I don't know how not to be, Ethan replied honestly. Yesterday I was coordinating evacuations. Today I'm walking in a royal garden under alien protection. Sarilith's gaze softened, not with pity but understanding. You believe you do not belong here. I know I don't. Lyria rose and moved closer to him, slipping her hand into his without ceremony. The contact was grounding, uncomplicated. You belong, she said simply. Ethan looked down at her, then back at Sarilith. That's a dangerous thing to let a child decide. Sarilith stepped closer, her presence suddenly very near. It was not her decision alone, she said quietly. It was mine. Ethan met her eyes, and for the first time he saw something beneath the authority. Resolve. You chose her without knowing her name, Sarilith continued. I choose you knowing exactly who you are. The words settled between them, heavy and intimate. Rest, she said. Learn, when you leave us you will not leave unchanged. Ethan believed her. As the wind swept through the garden, carrying the scent of frost and stone, he realized something unsettling and undeniable. For the first time in his life, walking away might be harder than running toward danger. Departure was quieter than Ethan expected. No ceremony, no speeches, no gathered court watching a human leave their world with borrowed significance. Just a ship waiting on a frost-lined platform and a sky so clear it felt unreal. Lyria stood beside her mother as Ethan approached the ramp. She wore a simple cloak this time, the kind meant for travel rather than display. Sarilith stood a half-step behind her, posture composed, gaze fixed not on the ship but on him. You are cleared for departure, Sarilith said. Your route has been adjusted. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Adjusted how? A minor detour, she replied evenly. One that aligns with your next assignment. That set off every instinct he had. Define minor. Sarilith's lips curved faintly. You will arrive sooner than expected, with more information than you would otherwise possess. Ethan exhaled. I should have known. Lyria stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his waist without warning. The contact was sudden, fierce, and utterly unceremonious. Come back alive, she said into his chest. You promise stories. He rested his hand carefully against her back. I keep my promises. Sarilith watched the exchange in silence. When Lyria stepped away, the queen moved closer. There will be those who test you, she said quietly. Some will provoke. Others will tempt. A few will attempt to put you in situations where your integrity costs you dearly. That's not new, Ethan replied. No, Sarilith agreed. But now the consequences extend beyond you. He nodded slowly. Then I'll be more careful. She studied him for a long moment. No, she said, you won't. Ethan huffed a breath. You're right. Her gaze softened, not indulgent but accepting. Just remember, she continued, that choosing correctly does not always mean choosing alone. That stayed with him as the ramp sealed and the ship lifted. The distress signal came 12 hours later. Border system. Civilian convoy. Hostile interdiction. Ethan was still reviewing preliminary data when the captain's voice cut through the bridge. Cole, you need to see this. The display shifted. A cluster of ships surrounded the convoy, unmarked, fast, and aggressive. Not pirates, too disciplined, too coordinated, private military contractors. Someone had decided these refugees were worth something. Ethan's jaw tightened. How long until first contact? He asked. Minutes, the captain replied. We're outgunned. Ethan's wrist display pulsed. The sigil glowed faintly beneath the fabric of his sleeve. He hesitated just once. Then he opened the channel. Varen Crown, he said calmly. This is Ethan Cole. The response was immediate. Sarilith's image formed, sharp and unmistakable. Report, she said. Ethan laid it out quickly, positions, armaments, intent, no emotion, just facts. When he finished, silence followed. Then Sarilith spoke. You are under no obligation to intervene. Ethan stared at the screen. They're civilians. Yes, she said, which is why this will be instructive. Another signal appeared on the tactical display. Varen transponders, multiple. Emerging from hyperspace. The hostile formation broke almost instantly. Some fled, others surrendered. A few were disabled with surgical precision. The convoy was safe within minutes. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The captain stared at him. What the hell did you just do? Ethan looked at the glowing sigil on his wrist. I asked for help, he said. Later, alone in his quarters, Ethan sat on the edge of his bunk, pendant resting cool against his palm. He recorded a message. Not a report, not a request, just a single line, they're safe. The reply came moments later. Good, no signature, no flourish, just that. Ethan lay back, staring at the ceiling as the ship slipped back into motion. He had returned to danger just as he'd said he would. But now, when the fire closed in and the math turned cruel, he knew something with absolute certainty. He was no longer invisible. And somewhere beyond the stars, someone powerful enough to reshape outcomes was paying attention, not because she owned him, not because she controlled him, but because she had chosen to stand beside him once, and meant it. Clearance came sooner than Ethan expected. Saren delivered the verdict with professional finality. His ribs were mended, his shoulders stable, the internal bruising reduced to little more than a reminder. He would ache for weeks, perhaps months, but nothing that justified confinement, nothing that justified staying. You are medically fit to return to duty, Saren said, with restrictions. Ethan smiled faintly. I always get restrictions. Yes, Saren agreed. You have a documented tendency to ignore them. That earned him a look, not reproachful, but assessing. As if Ethan were a recurring variable in equations Saren had learned to adjust for rather than eliminate. You will depart tomorrow, Saren continued. Her Majesty has requested a private audience before your departure. Ethan nodded, the weight of that simple statement settling deeper than expected. The audience chamber was smaller than he'd imagined. No throne, no banners, no assembled court, just stone, light, and quiet. Sarilith stood near the center of the room, dressed not in armor nor ceremonial robes, but in something in between, dark fabric reinforced subtly at the shoulders and arms, practical yet unmistakably regal. Her crown rested on a stone pedestal behind her rather than on her head, a deliberate choice. "You are leaving," she said, not as a question. "Yes," Ethan replied. "My team is already repositioning." "They will come to you," Sarilith said. "We have granted transit clearance." Ethan blinked. "You didn't have to." "I did," she interrupted calmly. "You do not return alone." That word again. Alone. Ethan shifted, suddenly aware of how much weight it carried now. "I won't pretend I know how this works," he said. "Your laws, your bonds, what it means to be family adjacent." Sarilith regarded him steadily. "You understand more than you think." "I understand duty," Ethan said. "I understand responsibility. I don't understand attachment." Her gaze sharpened, not in anger but in recognition. "Attachment," she said, "is not weakness. It is investment." She stepped closer, closing the distance with unhurried intent. Ethan felt it again, that subtle pressure of her presence, not overwhelming but undeniable. Power held in check by choice. "When I declared the vigil," she continued, "I accepted consequence, not only political, personal." Ethan frowned. "You keep saying that." "Because you keep underestimating what it cost me to stay," she replied softly. The room seemed to narrow around them. "Rulers are expected to be distant," Sarilith said. "Untouchable, to mourn privately, to value people in abstractions rather than faces. When I sat beside you, I made myself visible in a way I rarely allow." "Why?" Ethan asked quietly. "Because my daughter needed to see it," she said, "and because I needed to honor the truth of what you did." He swallowed. "I didn't save her because she was yours." "I know. I saved her because she was a child." Sarilith's eyes softened, something unguarded flickering there before discipline reclaimed it. "That is precisely why I trust you," she said. Silence stretched, not awkward, not empty, charged. "You will be watched," Sarilith continued. "Not only by allies and rivals, by my people, by my daughter." Lyria's name did not need to be spoken. "And by you," Ethan said. Sarilith met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." The admission landed heavier than any oath. "I won't change who I am," Ethan said. "I can't." "I would not ask you to," she replied. "If you did, the bond would lose its meaning." She reached out then, not to command, not to bind, but to rest her hand briefly against his forearm. The contact was light, deliberate, intimate in its restraint. "When you act," she said, "you act with the knowledge that you are not unseen." Ethan felt the truth of that settle into him, reshaping something he hadn't known was malleable. "For someone like you," Sarilith added, "that changes everything." Lyria found him later in the garden. She did not run this time. She walked, composed, carrying herself with the practiced dignity of someone learning when not to hide behind formality. "You are going," she said. "Yes." She nodded once, then held out a small object, a pendant, simple in design, etched with the same sigil Ethan had seen woven into Sarilith's robes. "So you remember," she said, "and so others know." Ethan accepted it carefully. "I don't think I could forget even without this." She studied him. "You will come back." It was not a question. "I will," he said, "I promise." Lyria considered this, then smiled, small but genuine. "That means you are still family adjacent," she said. Ethan laughed softly. "I suppose it does." As the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across stone and snow, Ethan felt something settle into place. He was returning to danger, to chaos, to choices that would demand everything he had. But this time, when he stepped back into the fire, he would do so knowing that somewhere beyond the stars, a queen watched not as a ruler assessing an asset, but as someone who had chosen to stay. The aftermath followed him longer than Ethan expected. Not the official reports. That part was clean, clinical, filled with approved language and carefully neutral phrasing. Civilian convoy secured. Hostile contractors dispersed. Minimal casualties. Mission success. It was the looks that lingered. Crew members who had worked with him for years now watched him differently, not with fear, not even with awe, with curiosity edged by caution, like he had become something undefined in their mental maps. Someone who could call a crown. Someone who didn't raise his voice or issue threats, but whose quiet words shifted fleets. Ethan hated it. He retreated into routine, burying himself in planning, logistics, preparation. It was easier to focus on numbers than on the subtle distance growing around him. Easier to be the officer who solved problems than the symbol others projected onto him. But symbols, he was learning, did not require consent. 2 days later the request came. Not a summons, an invitation. The message arrived encrypted, marked with the same sigil as before, but the tone was different, personal, unfiltered. Return when able. There is something I wish to discuss with you, without witnesses. Ethan read it twice. Once as an officer. Once as a man who remembered standing in a frozen garden while a queen admitted that staying beside him had cost her something. He requested leave within the hour. The citadel of Vera felt different the second time. Less overwhelming, less unreal, still beautiful, still imposing. But now when Ethan walked its halls, the guards inclined their heads. Not deeply. Not formally. Recognition without subservience. Family adjacent. He found Sarilith in a smaller chamber overlooking the western cliffs. No armor, no crown, just dark fabric and the pale light of a setting sun. You came quickly, she said. You asked, Ethan replied. That usually means it matters. She regarded him with something like approval. You used the bond. Yes, without hesitation. Yes, do you regret it? Ethan thought of the convoy. The children, the silence afterward. No, he said simply. Sarilith nodded. Good. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind rising outside, carrying the distant sound of ice shifting along the cliffs. You do not like what you have become, she said. Ethan let out a slow breath. I don't like being seen as leverage. You are not leverage, she replied sharply. You are precedent. That stopped him. When you called, Sarilith continued, you did not demand. You did not threaten. You stated facts and trusted that I would choose correctly. I did, Ethan said. And I did, she replied. Because you reminded me why power exists at all. Her gaze held his, steady, searching. In time, she said, others will try to imitate this, to claim moral authority without earning it. They will fail. Because they won't mean it, Ethan said. Yes. The words settled between them. Sarilith stepped closer, not invading his space, but narrowing the distance enough that he could feel the weight of her presence without armor or formality to blunt it. There is another reason I asked you here, she said quietly. Ethan felt it then, a shift. Not political, not procedural, personal. My daughter grows, Sarilith continued. One day she will rule. She will inherit a galaxy that watches how power is used. Ethan nodded. She's observant. She watches you, Sarilith said. She listens to your stories. She measures herself against what she believes you would do. That startled him. I never meant to be an example, he said. That, Sarilith replied softly, is why you are one. The silence that followed was different from before, not tense, intimate. You are free to walk away, Sarilith said at last, to live your life without further entanglement. The bond would remain, but I would not call upon it again. Ethan met her gaze. And if I do, Sarilith's voice lowered, steady and honest, then you will stand at the edge of power without being consumed by it. And I will no longer stand alone when I choose compassion over advantage. Ethan felt something shift, quietly, irrevocably. I don't want power, he said. Sarilith's lips curved, slow and restrained. Neither do I. They stood there as the sun dipped below the horizon, the light turning the cliffs gold and blue in equal measure. Two people bound not by desire, not by politics, but by the shared refusal to let the world harden them. And somewhere deep within the citadel, Lyria was listening to the wind and smiling, unaware that the shape of her future had just grown steadier. Because when the next impossible choice came, she would not face it alone. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet inevitability that unsettled Ethan more than any emergency ever had. There were no alarms, no screaming timelines, no frantic calculations racing against collapse. Instead, there was routine, measured, deliberate, almost ceremonial. Each morning began with light filtering through the citadel's high windows, illuminating stone floors warmed from beneath by unseen systems older than most human civilizations. Saren arrived without fail, overseeing Ethan's recovery with clinical precision and minimal commentary. The pain continued to fade, replaced by stiffness and the dull ache of healing muscles that reminded him he had been broken and put back together by hands that had no obligation to care so thoroughly. Afterward, Lyria would appear. Sometimes she brought books, thin crystalline tablets etched with moving glyphs that shifted into readable standard at her touch. Other times she arrived with questions, endless questions. Why do humans name storms? Why do you continue to rescue people who will never know your name? Is it true that Earth oceans can swallow cities? Ethan answered as best he could, discovering that explaining humanity to a curious alien child forced him to confront truths he had never articulated to himself. He spoke of duty without glory, of choices made in seconds that echoed for years, of how most people who ran toward danger never thought of themselves as brave. Lyria listened with absolute focus. Sarilith watched from a distance, always present, never intrusive. Ethan felt her attention even when she said nothing, an awareness that sharpened his senses, that made him conscious of his posture, his words, the subtle weight of being observed not as a subject but as a person of consequence. It was deeply uncomfortable and strangely affirming. On the fifth day, Sarilith requested his presence in one of the Citadel's upper galleries. Ethan arrived dressed in simple Varen garments Saren had provided, dark fabric, fitted but unadorned. He felt exposed without his uniform, stripped of the familiar markers that defined his role. Here, there were no ranks, no insignia, only him. The gallery opened onto a sheer drop overlooking the valley below. Wind swept through the open arches, cold and clean, carrying the distant cry of something winged far above the snowline. Sarilith stood at the edge, hands resting lightly on the stone railing. "You have avoided asking," she said without turning, "which suggests you already know the answer will trouble you." Ethan stepped beside her, careful not to crowd the space. "I assume that's about the political consequences." "Yes, then I'd rather hear it." Sarilith nodded once. "Your survival and the vigil are now public knowledge." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Of course they are." "Already," she continued, "several allied powers have requested clarification regarding your status. Others have expressed interest." "Interest in what?" he asked. "Recruitment, leverage." "Influence," Sarilith replied. "They see a human bound to the Varen crown and imagine utility." Ethan frowned. "I didn't agree to be a symbol." "No," she said quietly. "You agreed to be yourself. Others will attempt to redefine that." He leaned against the railing, gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I just want to go back to my work, save people, keep my head down." Sarilith turned to face him fully now. Up close, the restraint she carried was unmistakable, discipline honed over centuries of rule. "You will return to your work," she said. "Nothing in the bond prevents that. But you will no longer be invisible." The words landed heavier than any threat. "Invisibility," Sarilith continued, "is a privilege of those without consequence. You forfeited it when you chose my daughter over your own safety." Ethan looked at her then, really looked. The crown, the authority, the weight of an entire civilization carried behind calm blue eyes. "And you?" he asked quietly. "What does this cost you?" For the first time since they'd met, Sarilith hesitated. "Trust," she said. "Exposure, vulnerability." That surprised him. "You are seen," she continued. "When I declare someone under my personal protection, it reveals what I value. My enemies take note of such things." Ethan straightened. Then maybe this was a mistake. Sarilith's eyes sharpened, something colder flickering beneath the surface. "Do not diminish your choice to spare my comfort. I don't want to be a weakness." "You are not," she said firmly. "You are a statement." Silence stretched between them, filled only by wind and distant echoes. Lyria's laughter drifted upward from the garden below. Sarilith's gaze softened. "She asked me this morning if humans always stay after promises," Sarilith said. Ethan smiled faintly. "What did you tell her?" "That some do," she replied, "and those are the ones who matter." He felt that again. That subtle pull. That sense of alignment that had nothing to do with treaties or bonds. "I'll leave," Ethan said after a moment. "When I'm cleared, but I won't disappear." Sarilith inclined her head. "That is all I would ask." As they stood together overlooking the frozen valley, Ethan realized the truth he had been circling since the day he woke. Saving Lyria had not changed what he was. It had changed who was watching. Ethan left Vera at dawn, not because he was asked to, not because duty demanded it, because staying any longer would have made leaving harder than it needed to be. The citadel faded beneath the clouds as his ship ascended, stone and snow dissolving into pale light. He stood alone on the observation deck, hands clasped behind his back, posture familiar, steady. From the outside, he looked like the same officer who had arrived weeks ago, calm, composed, ready for whatever crisis waited beyond the jump. Inside, he knew better. Somewhere between a collapsing station and a silent vigil, something fundamental had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, no revelation or vow, just a quiet recalibration of what mattered. He touched the pendant at his chest without thinking. The next assignment came quickly. Outer systems, unstable governance, a refugee corridor forming under pressure from 3 competing powers. The kind of situation that didn't explode all at once, but could, if neglected, turn catastrophic. Ethan reviewed the data, issued orders, adjusted routes. He worked the way he always had. Methodical, precise, focused on outcomes rather than credit. But this time, when the math turned cruel and the margins disappeared, he did something different. He paused. Not long, just long enough to consider the people behind the numbers. Then he made the call that cost more in resources, more in time, more in political capital, and saved lives that would otherwise have been written off as acceptable losses. The corridor held. Civilians moved through safely. No fleets appeared. No crowns intervened. And that, Ethan realized, was the point. Later, in the quiet between shifts, he recorded a message, not a report, not a request, just words. "She asked me today why humans keep going back into dangerous places." He hesitated, then continued. "I told her it's because someone has to stay when everyone else leaves." The reply came hours later, delayed by distance but unmistakable. "Then she is learning correctly." He exhaled, tension easing from muscles he hadn't realized were tight. That night, as his ship drifted between stars, Ethan stood at the viewport and watched the galaxy slide past. Vast, indifferent, full of places where people would need help and choices would never be clean. He thought of Lyria, older now than when he'd found her in the wreckage, growing into someone who would one day inherit power she hadn't asked for. He thought of Sarilith, standing at the edge of authority, choosing restraint again and again in a universe that rewarded dominance. He understood now what the bond truly was, not protection, not obligation, witness. Someone had seen him at his most human, afraid, bleeding, choosing anyway, and decided that mattered enough to stay. And because of that, he would keep choosing. Not because a queen watched, not because a crown could answer, but because somewhere, beyond the reach of censors and politics, there were people who believed the right choice was still possible. As the stars stretched into the next jump, Ethan allowed himself a small, private thought, one he did not send, one he did not name. This wasn't the end of their story. It was simply the moment where paths, once intersected by chance, began to align by choice. And when the galaxy eventually demanded more than quiet integrity, when staying would cost everything, he already knew who would be standing beside him.
Pisarlo con la moto, si no se me hubiera caído. 1000 cosas en un segundo, es que es mágico, güey. Míralo. Mujer al volante, peligro constante. No mames, amiga, anticipación de carriles. Ay, cabrón. Ay, amiga, la anticipación de carriles no está... Ay, güey. Paz. Oh, no, mames.